Okay, today we're going to talk about stratigraphy and relative dating. So the first question that we have when we talk about stratigraphy and relative dating is to understand what we mean by those particular terms. And the first thing that we should do is define what stratigraphy is. So stratigraphy is the study of the order and the relative position of strata or layers and their relationship to the geologic timescale. So in this photograph at the bottom of the slide, we can see that there are many different layers of geologic material that appear differently because they're slightly different colors, indicating different mineralogy and chemical composition. And then they've been upended on their side and they've been separated, and so we can learn a lot about the geologic history of this landscape by interpreting their relative position. So that's kind of what stratigraphers are. There are 7 main principles that we apply when we're trying to understand the relative age of different layers on the landscape and help the position of those layers to allow us to reconstruct the history there. And the first principle is called uniformitarianism. And we mentioned uniformitarianism in our discussion of metamorphic rocks, but to remember, uniformitarianism is the principle that the present is the key to the past, and that the same way that processes behave today is the way that they behaved in the past. So if we watch a mountain erode at a certain rate, maybe it erodes 2 or 3 feet of material a year, then we should assume that's the same kind of behavior that was occurring in the past. And if we want to imagine how long it would take to carve out an area like the Grand Canyon, we would need to add up all those if we want to think about how we could add up how long it would take to carve out an area like the Grand Canyon, we would need to think about how many years of subsequent, 1 or 2 years of erosional progress would add up to creating such a big canyon. So that's what uniformitarianism is. The next principle that's important to relative dating tells us that layers are originally composed in a horizontal way. So like on the last slide, we saw layers that were angled at a diagonal, and we know that that is not how those layers were created. Most layers of geologic material are created as fluids like water or air, move the material, and they settle out with fairly flat surfaces. And so when they're turned up on end, then that is something that happens subsequent to their formation. The third principle is called superposition, and superposition tells us that the layer that's on top is most likely the youngest layer. So sometimes things can be completely turned on end, but unless we have a reason to believe that that happened, we should make the assumption that the geologic material that's sitting on top is going to be younger, just like if you stacked up a bunch of books or papers, the one that was sitting on top would be the last one that you put into place. So in this picture, the gravelly layers on top are younger than the older red and white streaked layers below. The fourth principle is called lateral continuity. So lateral is when things are going out horizontally next to each other. And the idea here is that when things are currently disconnected, but they are very similar to each other and exist in similar locations, we can probably assume that they used to be part of one continuous piece. So for instance, layers on the south rim of the Grand Canyon and on the north rim of the Grand Canyon that are at the same elevation and are the same thickness and are made of the same material are no longer connected, but we can probably assume that at one point before the river cut down in between them, they used to be connected, and it's not a complete coincidence that we have the same set of layers on both sides of where the river sits today. All right, the fifth principle is about cross-cutting relations, and cross-cutting relations tell us about different kinds of intrusions that cut into rocks. So things like sills or dikes or magma chambers. And so we've discussed these things in the past, and we know that this magma that creates these kinds of features bubbles up into country rock that is already in existence. So therefore, if we see a magma intrusion or we see a dike and then we look at the rock around it, then that rock must be older than the intrusion. So the intrusion is younger because it inserted itself into something that was already there that is older. Then principle 6 is about baked contacts. And when we talked about intrusions in the context of metamorphic rocks, we learned that when these hot magma intrusions come in contact with older country rock, they often bake the rock and metamorphose the rock to change its chemical composition. So here again, the baked contact must have been there before the magma showed up if it was able to be changed by the magma. So the baked contact is older while the intrusion that's cutting across it is younger. And then the final principle tells us about inclusions. These are materials that get included inside magma chambers or sills or dikes, other kinds of intrusions. And we've referred to these before as xenoliths, these kind of foreign rocks that don't melt but then break off the sides of areas around magma and float around in the magma until they get re-solidified as part of the magma. And these inclusions or xenoliths represent that older material that was there before the magma showed up. And so these inclusions must be older than the magma or the new intrusions. And so geologists use these principles to help them reconstruct the history of landscapes and try to understand not necessarily the absolute age of each layer. So, for instance, we couldn't tell in this photograph here that the red layer below was 200 or 300 million years old, but we can tell that relatively it was probably existing before the layer on top. So that's what this idea of relative dating is all about. And before we had modern atomic technology that allowed us to actually calculate absolute dates, which we'll talk about next, this was the main way that geologists used to try to reconstruct the history of the Earth. So I just have a couple pictures to show you of other interesting areas where there's a lot of neat and beautiful stratigraphic layers or strata in the Earth's history. This is an area that's a national park in China that's called the Rainbow Mountains, and I just have never been here, but I'm very intrigued by this place. I thought you guys might want to check it out. We can see all these different layers, and we know that they were not originally laid down in this position, but they have been subsequently turned on their side after their formation, since they are no longer horizontal, and we know that layers are originally formed in a horizontal way. So, geologists spend a lot of time looking at rock formations and trying to reconstruct their history by reading the formations. And so here's kind of a simplistic example. I have a couple different layers here labeled A through E. And in this case, what I would imagine as a geologist is that layer C down on the bottom is the oldest layer, and then B is younger than that, and A is younger than that. And according to the rule of superposition, I can understand that the layers follow that particular order. Then I can see that a layer D seems to be cutting across all of those layers. So even though D also touches the bottom like C, D is younger because it's cutting into a bunch of layers that must have been around it to support it at the time it was formed. So that is actually a relatively young layer. And then the final thing that would have happened in this particular diagram is E, the fault that has displaced the D intrusion, but also layers A and B and part of C as well. And because that fault is displacing all of the things in the picture, it must have occurred after all of those things had already existed. And so, again, this is the kind of technique that geologists use to try to understand the history of landscapes. It's worth mentioning that stratigraphy works well on sedimentary rocks and also on layered igneous rocks, rocks that are formed from things like lava flows or mud flows, pyroclastic flows, and then also relates well to intrusions that cut across those layers. But sometimes it can be a little bit muddied when we have different kinds of metamorphic rocks in the mix. So in particular, this is a technique that's used for certain types of rocks that we find in formations. Okay, here's a more challenging one. I'm going to give you guys a minute to try to work this out yourself, and then I'll walk you through it. So you can pause the video and try to work from the oldest layer to the youngest layer and see how you would set up these different layers to try to understand if you can use those principles to think like a stratigrapher. Okay, I'm back. So now that you've paused and spent a little bit of time to think about it, what I would recommend is that you always start from the bottom. And in this case, we have two layers on the bottom, layer E and layer A. Layer A appears to me to be an intrusion, some sort of magma chamber from the way that it's shaped. And so I think that A probably cut through E, and therefore I would say E is likely the oldest layer. Then the layer that's sitting on top of E is G. L is sitting on top of E, or L is sitting on top of G, and C is sitting on top of L. So according to superposition, E would be the oldest and C would be the youngest. Then we have H, a layer that's separating or displacing the layers. So that's interrupting their lateral continuity, but we can imagine they would have originally been continuous. H doesn't cut up into M, so I think it occurred before M was formed. Next, I would guess layer M, then D, then J. At that point, the intrusion A seems to have cut into the layers, and it seems to have made its way up in through layer J, but then abruptly stops at the layer J, so I think it occurred after J, but before N. Then I would guess layer N, K, B. And then finally layer F on the top is a new layer that we can see is kind of being formed in a horizontal manner. So here's the key that I have over here that you can use to check yourself. All right, so another thing that geologists do is they make what are called stratigraphic columns or strat columns, which are these big diagrams I have shown on the right-hand side of the slide that show all the different kinds of layers that they would find within a particular geologic formation. So these geologic formations would have lots of narrow beds that make them up, and then they could have groups of several different beds that seem to be of the same type, and then they might have formations, several formations that seem to be of the same type that might be, again, grouped together into a group, and then this whole kind of diagram showing all the different kinds of layers like we see here for the Grand Canyon, again, is called a stratigraphic column. And stratigraphic columns we use to try to allow us to understand what's underneath the earth. And in some places, such as big river canyons like the Grand Canyon, we have a really nice view into what lies below the surface of the Colorado Plateau. But we're not quite so lucky in all places. And so geologists use other strategies as well to help them understand what's underneath the ground. We've discussed some of these already. So we can use clues in places where nature has already exposed the area under the ground, like river channels, or we can use areas where humans have worked to expose what's under the ground, such as road cuts or mines. Also, geologists do a lot of core sampling. So the photographs I have here are of this big kind of hollow drill that's used to go down into the earth and pull out a bunch of segments of rock that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, and then we can learn about what's under the ground that way. And then a final way that we've discussed so far is through seismic interpretation. So we can look at how different kinds of seismic or earthquake waves travel through the earth and then make some interpretations about the density and the types of materials that might be underneath the earth by looking at the speed and the direction that those layers move. So, it's nice to be able to make a nice stratigraphic column, but we might need to be able to get creative to really understand what we would want to be able to put in our column in places that are more hidden from view. All right, another concept that I want to introduce is something that's called an unconformity. So an unconformity is a place in the landscape where no sediment accumulation has taken place, or at least there's no representation of that sediment accumulation that still exists today. So there may be that there was, for some reason, not much sediment accumulation on the landscape during a particular geologic period of time. Or perhaps there was in the past a period of sediment accumulation that led to the formation of rocks. But then something after that happened that caused all that material to be blown or washed away, and so that there's no longer a record today of that material existing. And there's a variety of different types of unconformities that geologists look at. We'll show some examples of each of these. They're called angular unconformities, nonconformities, and disconformities. But if you look at the picture here that's taken from coastal Washington state, you can see that there's some layers below that are shale, a bunch of these kind of layered material that seems to be turned on its side, on a diagonal. We know that's not the original position that those layers would have occupied. So we know there must have been some fairly significant force that would have allowed those materials to be upended, and that's not the kind of thing that would have occurred overnight. That would have taken time for that to build up and then to shear off kind of a fairly flat surface on the top of those layers. And then on top of that, we see layers that are oriented in a different direction, these kind of sedimentary gravel layers. And because the orientation of the layers on top is so different than the layers below, we know there must have been some significant period in between the time that the layers on the bottom were accumulating compared to the time that the layers on the top were accumulating. It's not as if this whole landscape was all of a sudden turned on its side overnight and then started accumulating sediment on top of it. Something happened in between, and in this case, it doesn't seem like there's a record of material that was accumulated during that period. So we would call this point of contact between the lower layers and the upper layers an unconformity. So the example on the last slide that we gave was an angular unconformity. And here's another example of an angular unconformity in the classic area to see all these things, which is the Grand Canyon. And in this case, we have layers towards the bottom of the Grand Canyon that are oriented in a different direction compared to the layers up above. So the Uncur group compared to the Tonto group is at a different orientation. And we know that the folding of these layers, the bending of these layers must have occurred before these layers were exposed to the Earth's surface and allowed to accumulate layers on top of them. And so as we discussed on the long slide, there must have been a period of time that occurred when that transformation was taking place, and that period of time is not likely captured in any of the sedimentary record. So there's going to be an offset in the age of the layers at one angle below the unconformity, and then the layers on top at a different orientation are going to be younger, and there'll be a gap in the geologic history in between those 2 points. The next type of unconformity that can occur is called a nonconformity, and this happens when sedimentary layers overlie intrusive igneous or metamorphic layers. And so in this case, we know the conditions that would be required for an intrusive igneous rock or metamorphic rock to form are very different than the kinds of environments where sedimentary rocks form, right? We know magma chambers exist deep down in the earth. We know metamorphic change occurs deep at environments of high pressure and temperature. And so they're not the kind of places where sedimentary materials pile up just right on top of them. And so if sedimentary layers are piling up right on top of them, then there must have been a period of time where the old material that used to sit on top of them was eroded away before those new sediments started to accumulate. And so that period of time, again, would be missing from the geologic record, and that would be an example of another unconformity, and in this case, specifically a nonconformity. So we see this at the contact between things like the Zoroaster granite and the Unkar group in the Grand Canyon again. Finally, and a little bit more tricky to distinguish, is a kind of unconformity that's called a disconformity. A disconformity is when there are non-continuous periods of sediment accumulation. So the layer below and the layer on top of the unconformity may be very similar. They may be of the same type. They may be of the same orientation. But something occurred that may be difficult for us to see that would cause the layer below to be quite a bit older than the layer above, and again, for there to be some missing piece of the geologic record in between. So maybe there is a period of rising sea level or falling sea level or changing climate that would cause the accumulation of a certain kind of material to start or stop. But these, again, are more difficult to pick out than the other kinds of unconformities because they're not quite as visually distinct. But we can use other techniques like the use of fossils or the use of absolute dating that we'll talk about later to help us pick out where these disconformities may exist on the landscape. And there are several places in the Grand Canyon where we see these. For example, at the contact between the Supai group and the Red Wall limestone group, as seen in the diagram on the right. Okay, so we mentioned in the last slide that sometimes when the different kind of angle or the contact between two different rocks is not enough for us to help reconstruct the history of the landscape, we have to use other techniques like depending on fossils or like depending on absolute dating. So the use of fossils to help us reconstruct the landscape is called biostratigraphy, right? The use of living organisms or historic living organisms, prehistoric living organisms in the stratigraphic record. And the idea is that these fossils can help date and give context to the different layers that we see. And in general, we know that not all fossils are found throughout the column. Certain organisms existed in the past, and certain organisms existed today. And we also know that once a fossil disappears from the geologic record, we don't expect to get it back because that fossil represents an organism that has become extinct. And so we can look at how certain fossils enter and then disappear from the fossil record to help us additionally recreate the history of the landscape. And especially now that we have techniques like absolute dating that allow us to figure out the specific age of different fossils, when we do find those fossils at other places in the geologic record, we can give those spaces a specific range of times when they could have formed, which are the times when those specific types of organisms existed or roamed around on the landscape. In particular, there's types of fossils that we call index fossils, and these are fossils that are somewhat easily recognizable and that we know only existed during a very specific period of time. And so we also talked about index fossils in the case of we talked about index minerals in the case of metamorphic rocks, and these work in a fairly similar way. So the idea is if we see them in a particular layer, then we know that that layer could have only formed during a certain geologic time. So ammonites are one of the most famous and most beautiful fossils that we see out there. Here's a picture of an ammonite. And ammonites are Mesozoic era organisms. So if a layer has an ammonite in it, it must have formed during the Mesozoic era. Other famous index fossils include things like trilobites. Trilobites existed at an earlier time compared to ammonites. They existed during the Paleozoic era. And then also, just like index minerals, in many cases we might have multiple types of fossils that are layered together in the same layer, and they might have a certain period of their history on the earth that overlaps, but not the whole entire period of that organism's history. And so by seeing when specific organisms overlap, we can narrow down the time period when the formation occurred more narrowly. And then, of course, also people that study this more specifically can recognize many different kinds of ammonites or trilobites or other organisms. And so there's many different kinds of species of each of these things that would have occurred during a more narrow window within these different geologic eras. And so that can additionally help us pinpoint narrow down the time when the particular geologic layer was formed. Finally, I'll mention that another thing that geologists do is try to correlate certain strata that they see in one area with strata that they find in another area. And this can be tricky because sometimes layers that accumulate in one area don't necessarily accumulate the same way in an area nearby. Maybe the climate is kind of different, or the landscape is a little bit farther away from a floodplain or something else. And so we might have certain layers in one area that are a little bit different than layers in another area nearby. And so in this case, the geologists have to kind of use a combination of the kinds of tools that they have, looking at the stratigraphic principles and the principles of relative dating. They also have to use the fossils that they see, and they try to correlate that different information across the landscape, and they might find that a layer of one type on the right has fossils of a certain organism, while layers of another type, maybe a limestone versus sandstone, contain that same organism across the landscape. And so maybe even though they're not the same kind of rock, they may have occurred during the same period of time. So that's kind of called fossil correlation. And then more broadly, geologists use a strategy called lithologic correlation, where they're trying to use, again, all the different kinds of tools, the presence of fossils and the presence of different layers and their understanding of relative dating, to try to connect layers on one area to layers in another area. So again, these matches aren't going to be perfect, but especially the closer the areas are, the more likely we'll see similarity among the different kinds of strata that we see. And one strategy that geologists will use is to look for marker beds or very unique layers that might exist in two different areas. And then if they can place those at the same period of time, then they can kind of work above and below those layers to help reconstruct how the overlying parts and the underlying parts may match. So this discussion of fossils brings us to the point of wanting to make sure that we actually understand what a fossil is. And there's a lot of different kinds of fossils that form on the landscape. But essentially, fossils are typically created in some sort of sedimentary environment. And there's a variety of kinds of sedimentary environments that can be formed. So maybe it's a sedimentary environment that's filled with a bunch of organic sediment, like a big tar pit. You might have heard of the La Brea tar pits before. But more commonly, these would just be areas where there's accumulation of different kinds of loose sediments that maybe are being moved by water or wind, by floods, or also loose debris that would be introduced by a volcanic eruption. And when these sedimentary environments rapidly bury organisms, they cut those organisms off from the surface, and therefore they cut them off from oxygen. And oxygen is usually required by microorganisms to allow those microorganisms to decompose organic material. So that's what happens when things die at the surface or near the surface. Microorganisms break them down, but if they're rapidly buried and sealed off from oxygen and from those organisms, then they're going to persist on the landscape. And over time, they will persist in various ways. Certain types of the minerals may just be very resistant, so they might not break down quickly, even over long periods of time. Certain parts of an organism are able to be accessed and decomposed by organisms. So something like bones or teeth are just a little bit more sturdy and will exist for a long period of time. On the other hand, another process called mineral precipitation sometimes occurs, or paramineralization. And in this case, what happens is that water that contains things like silica flows through an organism, and then the silica starts to form minerals that kind of coat the shape of the inside of the organism. And so they make almost like a complete cast of the organism, but over time, the parts that were actually alive, that were the cells, disappear, and then only the silica replication is left. So this is what happens in the case of petrified wood. Other fossils are not actually representations of parts of an organism, but they're just representations of traces of an organism. So maybe an animal stepped in a mud flat, and then that mud flat became rapidly buried, and so that its footprint was captured on the landscape over time. And then finally, there's another kind of group of fossils that are interesting where a body is actually frozen. So we have many woolly mammoths that we are finding up in areas of the Arctic as glaciers are receding. People are exploring up there where the organism has been preserved just because it's remained so cold over time. So this is an exhaustive list of different types of fossils, but there are different types of reasons that things may be captured in a different strata in the landscape, and then when we find these things in there, we can use them to help us have an idea about the relative age of these different layers. Here's just a picture of some petrified wood. This is from the Petrified Forest National Park that's in Arizona, and I've actually never been there, but I've seen some other petrified wood in other places in the past. That's pretty interesting. So anyway, might be worth checking out. All right, well, that concludes our discussion for today. Next time we'll come back and talk about absolute dating. All right, have a nice afternoon.